Bullshit. Bullshit. Derivative. That I love. I absolutely love.
That's just the Drone Geek.
I want it. It's everything.
What's up? It's Chris, the Drone Geek, and today I'm bringing you an Adobe Lightroom Classic tutorial. If you use a drone in your photography arsenal, whether you're a photographer that uses a drone as a tool in your tool belt, or you just use drones for photography and videography purposes, it's important that you understand how to edit landscape photography, because I would be willing to bet 7 times out of 10 your photo is a landscape photo. That's what drones are really good at, getting way up high and taking a picture of a landscape from an angle that not many people can usually get. But because drones are becoming so widespread and just about anybody can get their hands on one, it's also becoming saturated. Those pictures are becoming a dime a dozen, and it's important that you get a leg up on all of those other drone photographers out there, or people with a drone trying to take photographs, and set your photos apart from the rest. You can do that very easily using Adobe Lightroom in just the right way. Now, there are 2 versions of Lightroom. There's Adobe Lightroom and there's Adobe Lightroom Classic. Right now, I prefer Adobe Lightroom Classic. I think it's a little bit easier to use, and honestly, it's not as nuanced and it doesn't have some of the more clunky things that the new Lightroom has. I think it went backwards when they brought out new Lightroom as opposed to Lightroom Classic. So we're gonna be using Adobe Lightroom Classic. In the future, I might do the same tutorial using Adobe Lightroom. Really, the process is going to be very similar because other than a few clunky processes that they added to Adobe Lightroom, the interface is almost exactly the same. All right, so we start on our desktop. Obviously, this is the first step, and you'll see on my desktop I've got shortcuts for Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Lightroom Classic. We touched on this in the intro of the video, talked about the differences between the two. I still just want to reiterate, Lightroom is sleeker, it looks a little cooler, but overall some of the processes, some of the ones that should be very easy, are a little bit less efficient and clunky, at least as far as I've discovered. So I haven't really grown fond of this yet. I'm sure in time I'll grow to like this more and more. I try to use it every once in a while just to learn it a little bit better and learn some of the shortcuts that come with it. So for the meantime, we're gonna be sticking to Adobe Lightroom Classic. This is where I'm a little bit more comfortable and I feel that the processes are a little bit more efficient. So we'll go ahead and double click to open that up. And you'll see here that it opens up the main starting screen for Adobe Lightroom Classic. Now, it has no data here, other than my history over here, but let's ignore that for now. We really can't do much of anything. We have no photos imported, we've got nothing in the navigator, and we can't do anything over here with our development tools. So what do we have to do? Obviously, the second step is to add photos to this by importing them. So we'll go to File, we'll go to Import Photos and Videos, and again, Adobe Lightroom can import videos, but all you can do through Lightroom is preview them. You can't actually edit them. So just ignore this for now unless you want to preview your videos. Otherwise, you might just want to open them in your File Explorer. That's how I preview most of my videos. But you can edit photos. So that's what we'll do. We'll click Import Photos and Videos. And that pulls up this screen here. Now you can go ahead over here and navigate through your directories using this menu. I don't really like to do that. I feel like it's a waste of time and it's not necessarily the most efficient way to import the photos. What I prefer to do, and what Adobe Lightroom Classic can do that Adobe Lightroom cannot, is just drag and drop. So I'll go down to my File Explorer and I'll go into my Mavic 2 footage. I'll go to my Pro footage, and I'm just gonna use some photos from our most recent shoot in January here. Up yonder. This is back in my hometown area in the Pine Creek Valley. We're gonna select a photo to edit. So one of my favorite photos from this shoot has to be looking down toward the Pine Creek Dam. So we'll go ahead and we'll find one of those. And it looks like it would potentially, I think it's gonna be 456. So we'll go ahead and click that just to select it. Click it once, and then we'll go ahead and click it again and hold and drag it into the window. You'll see that little icon pops up there under my arrow that allows you to then drop that picture into the menu. So we'll go ahead and let go and drop it in, and you'll see that it's selected. Now, what's nice about dragging and dropping is it pulls up all of the photo files in that particular area of the drive. So if I wanted to edit more, I could go ahead and select them through this menu and edit the photos as I saw fit. But we're just gonna stick with one for this tutorial. So we'll go ahead and import it. And you'll see here that we have our selected photo in the library screen. Now, in order to edit this photo, you have to come up here to Develop, click on that. and it pulls up the photo so that you can now edit it with the tools on the right-hand menu. So just for the sake of the thumbnail and showing you before and after, I do want to export this just as it is. And Adobe Lightroom OG, that works. We're gonna export it to our Lightroom edited photos. So we'll just go ahead and export it. And there you are. All right, so back to this photo. We want to bring the best out of this photo because otherwise it's just another landscape photo taken by just another drone. There are some really great features to this photo that we can bring out to really highlight just how special this photo is compared to others. If you look at the white in the snow that has fallen through the valley here, that's gonna be really important that we bring these whites out because it's gonna be one of the brighter parts of the photo. Also, we've got a lot of brown from the dead trees in the mountains, but we also have a lot of evergreen trees right here in the foreground. And we can really bring that green out to bring some contrast between the blue in the sky, the white in the snow, the brown in the mountains, and then of course the green on the trees. So those are gonna be our two main objectives. I also want to bring out some definition in these clouds because the sky was very pretty that day. And you can see here that it is a really nice sky, but we could obviously make this pop a little bit more and bring some really cool definition to this photo. So let's go ahead and let's start with basic adjustments. Now you can do this manually and play with it. What I like to do, and it's a little shortcut that I use, is I click on Auto. And that already brings me sort of where Adobe Lightroom thinks I should be, and there are some things that I'd like to change about this auto adjustment that it's made, but overall, it's got us a little bit closer to what we were trying to accomplish. It's brought out the whites in the snow, it's brought out the green in this mountain a little bit, and there's some really dynamic contrast as opposed to where we started. So this is a very flat image, and when we do that auto adjustment, it brings some really stark contrast between some of the elements in this photo, but we're not done yet. Now, let's start with the white balance. So in this section, you can go ahead and edit based upon a certain set of criteria. If you want it to auto white balance, you can do that, and it'll set the white balance according to what Adobe Lightroom thinks it should be. You can go by the daylight, so if it's a really bright sunny day, you might want to go with this. And it's got a few other options that we're not going to go through all of them because it just sort of be getting away from what this video is actually about. I like to select as shot because I'm comfortable with where the Mavic 2 Pro comes out in its white balance. Mavic 2 Pros tend to take pictures that are a little bit on the warm side. So you'll see here that we've got a slightly yellow tint, especially in the snow area. You can see that maybe there's just a little bit of a golden tint to it. So that's at a 6500, which already leans a little bit cool, but it's not quite cool enough for us. So let's go ahead and we'll bring this down to 6000 and see how it looks. As you can see, we've already eliminated some of the yellow tint off of this photo. So we're really close to where we want to be, but I think I'm going to bring it into the cool side just a little bit more. Let's go to 5750. Okay, that's a lot better, and it's a lot more true to form as to what it looked like during the hike that we took to get this picture. So I really like where this is at. Let's just bump it up maybe a little bit to make it a little bit warmer, might be a little extreme. Okay, this is much truer to form. It was a small adjustment, but I can tell you that I feel a lot more comfortable with 5850 as opposed to 5750. Now the tint, if you go up, you can make it a magenta. If you go down, you can make it a green. I'm gonna go back to 34, which was the default setting, but our mission is to bring out the greens in these evergreen trees. So I like to go ahead and play with this just a little bit because a little bit goes a long way with the tint slider. So you'll see here, if we go down to 30, it brings a little bit too much green out for it to be natural. So I like to bring it down from 34 to about 32. That helps the greens pop without putting any green in these bluer areas that might throw off how natural the photo should look. So I'm pretty happy there with the white balance. Let's move down to our tone section of the menu. So you'll see here we can adjust the exposure, the contrast, the highlights, the whites, the blacks, and the shadows, of course. So we'll go ahead and we'll set the exposure to 0. All right, so you'll see maybe it's a little bit underexposed when we have it set at 0. So we'll go ahead and we'll bump it up to 0.25. I'm pretty comfortable with that. I thought 0.45 was a little too bright, especially since we're gonna be playing with the highlights, the shadows, and the whites and the blacks as well. So we'll keep it at 0.25. Contrast, I like to have a little bit more. I usually set my contrast for landscape photography, especially a photo like this, around 20. 21 seems pretty comfortable for me as well. So 20 will be just fine for the contrast. Now is where we get into the highlights. So we're gonna get to a brush tool that'll allow us to touch up individual areas of this photo and not the photo as a whole. So we want to keep that in mind when we adjust our highlights. They're a little low for my liking. We'll bring this back up to -47. I feel a little happier with how the whites and the lighter areas of this particular photo are starting to pop now. We don't have it quite as dark before with the highlights. Down at -74, we've got a -47, which still mutes those highlights. They're not too bright, blowing out parts of the image, but it's also allowing for the whites and those brighter areas of the photo to still stand out, which is what's gonna give a lot of life to this photo, the balance between highlights and shadows. And speaking of shadows, you'll see here we've got some really dark areas, and we've got some not so dark areas. You can see some detail of like this valley here, but you can tell that there's a shadow cast from this mountain right here. So what happens with shadows and what people do wrong a lot of the time is they'll bring up the brightness on their shadows too much, and you'll cause some pixelation in your shadowed area. So if we bring the shadows up real bright, you'll see here, especially down in here, you get a lot of noise with pixelation. Now this is already a pretty noisy area with all of the trees, but if you look between the gaps in the trees, you can see some additional noise that we could really help to prevent if we just played with the shadow slider the right way. So let's bring this down. And we do want to boost the shadows a little bit. I think the auto setting had it set at like 36. I can't quite hit that, so we'll go ahead and have it at 37. But you'll see here, even at positive 37, we still have a lot of noise through those regions. And honestly, we want to keep this mountain a little bit darker because it gives us some perspective and allows us to focus on what we want to focus on in this photo, which is the dam, the valley leading off of the dam, and then this mountain in the foreground where we're going to have a lot of contrast off of the greens of the trees and the white of the snow covering the mountain. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring the shadows down and darken that area up. Now you see that this mountain just got very dark. We're at +4 for the shadows, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. And when we adjust the individual regions later, you'll see that we'll maintain this lighter part where the snow is shining through here, but also keep this mountain darker than this one to allow us to focus on the right area of this photo. So we'll go down to whites then. We don't want to blow the whites out too much. So if we bring the whites up all the way, it's ruining the sky. It's making it way too bright up here. And honestly, it's making the snow too bright right through here. Now here we have the trees sticking up that allow for some texture through there and allow for some detail to be retained. But down here, if we bring the slider back down, you'll see that we have some detail that we blow out when we bring that white too high. So there's some grass and some weeds through here. There's some texture and detail to the snow that's laying on top of the ice. There's just a lot that we lose when we bring the whites up too high, but we still want those whites to pop. So I like to bring the whites up just a little bit until we start to see some detail being lost. I'll bring it back right to that threshold. So at about 47, let's go down to 44. About 44 is where we find the balance of bringing the whites out without blowing out all of the detail through that region. We also maintain our clouds and the contrast between the blue sky and the white clouds. So that's a good balance for our whites. And then our blacks do largely the same thing that the shadows and the highlights do, as well as the whites. Those black colors in our photo will either be lighter and make it a little less contrasty, or darker, make it too contrasty. We don't want them this dark. This is a little bit overkill, and we obviously don't want them this light because we lose a lot of the contrast between the dark and the light areas. And really, I don't play with the black slider too much. I like to keep that right in the middle if I can. 0 usually works out just fine. If anything, I'm usually bringing the black slider down to make sure that those blacks are pronounced and that we have a nice contrast in our photo. But for this one, I think 0 will do just fine. Now, in our presence section, we have texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. If you've been editing photos for any amount of time, you know what vibrance and saturation do. Vibrance is going to make those colors brighter. Saturation is going to pronounce those colors just a lot more than normal. So we have those set at auto. I usually like to keep my vibrance at around 20, but I like to bring my saturation up, especially in cases where we've got a lot of color contrast, to about 15 and really bring out some of those brighter colors. So that really helps a lot. And you'll see that we added a lot of color to some of the areas of our photo here. So let's move up to the rest of the sliders in the presence menu. So if we go ahead and play with texture a little bit, you'll see the higher texture goes, the more pronounced we're gonna have, especially this area with a lot of trees, that detail is going to be. We're gonna have a lot more texture, for lack of a better term. We're gonna have a lot more of a lifelike feel, whereas we bring the texture down, it blurs it out a lot, and it just sort of looks like an oil painting gone wrong. So we wanna make sure that we balance the texture accordingly. We don't wanna have it super rigid, but we don't obviously wanna have it this blurred either, not for this particular photo. So for texture, clarity, and dehaze, my breakdown is typically 25, which brings a nice level of texture to a landscape photo, 20 for the clarity, And that brightens up some of the more contrasted areas through here. You'll see that you can actually see between the details of the trees and the whites of the mountain, especially in this area. It does some for out here, but in this more pronounced foreground, it definitely defines those regions between the white of the snow and the texture of the trees that dot the mountain. And you'll see here when you do the dehaze versus not doing the dehaze, it takes away a layer of fogginess. It actually brings a little bit more what I feel is definition to the photo. So we go from somewhat flat to a lot more definition overall. So that's my breakdown for these particular sliders. You can play around with this and find what you're comfortable with, but 25, 20, and 15 are typically where I have my sliders set for my landscape photography. We'll scroll down. I don't play with the regions very much. Sometimes I will, just to sort of get a little bit more pop out of my balance between highlights, shadows, lights, and darks. But in this particular photo, I'm not gonna do a lot with this today. I'm actually not gonna touch it at all. So now we'll move down to our HLS and color menu, and this is where you can have a lot of fun with your photos creatively. So the colors that we mentioned at the beginning of the video were green, brown, white, and blue. Those are the main colors of this photo, so we want to focus on those largely. However, we do need to pay attention down here to orange and yellow, because those two colors are going to play a role along the banks of the creek. So we'll go ahead and we'll skip red. There's not a lot of red in this photo to really play with, and we'll go to orange. So if you bring the orange all the way up, you'll see that bank off of the creek becomes very, very orange and very, very defined. We actually want to bring this out a little bit, but not as much as we bring out the other colors in this photo. So we'll bring the orange up to, let's say, about 15. And we'll do the yellows up to about 10. What happens if you bring these up too far together is you'll get that warm feeling on your photo overall, especially in these areas where the banks are brown and maybe a little bit yellowish or orangish. And we're trying to keep this photo on the cool side because it is a winter photo, so we want to avoid that at all costs. 15 and 10 though, overall, aren't going to really ruin the balance as far as temperature goes in this photo. Now we come to one of our first major colors, which is green. So we want to make sure the greens in these evergreens is really popping off this mountain, especially in contrast to the white in the snow that's laying on top of it. So we'll bring green up all the way to see what that does. And you'll see there's not a huge change, but that's where luminance is going to come into play. So we'll bring the greens up to about 30, double what we did our oranges and our yellows. We come to aqua, which is more of this region right here where the mountains sort of phase out a little bit and the detail's lost because they're a little bit farther away. So we lose some detail there and it gives it more of a blue tint. So we'll go ahead and we'll bring the blue up just a little bit, maybe to 10. And then we come down to the blue slider, which is going to impact directly the sky. It's also going to impact some of the regions where we have some cooler shadows, especially right here. You're gonna see some changes because this is largely blue right here. So we don't wanna get too crazy with it, but we also want to make sure that we make this main color of blue pop a little bit more because it makes the picture a little bit more appealing. So we'll bring the blue up to about 25. And you'll see that it's become much deeper up here towards the top of the sky, and we really haven't made it too blue down here through the shadow region. So that's a pretty successful adjustment that we made in the saturation of the blue. Purple and magenta are very closely related to red, so we don't need to make any changes to that. So now we'll move on to the luminance section of the HSL and color menu. Now you'll see here that we can either go all the way up and make the orangish, yellowish areas very, very bright, or we can go all the way down and make them very, very dark. It looks like dark, dark dirt, soil that's maybe saturated with water, or you can go all the way up and say, hey, look, the sun is shining on there. Now, you have to think about how we're trying to angle this photo. What are we trying to do? We're trying to define this with highlights as well as this, and bring the shadows down on this in this area to sort of really pronounce this part of the photo, which is where we're trying to draw the attention of the viewer. So what would make more sense if we're trying to bring highlights up through this region later on in this tutorial? Would it be to darken it, or would it be to make it lighter? In my opinion, we definitely want to go lighter because it makes it more consistent with what we're trying to accomplish in this particular region of the photo. So we won't go all the way up to 100. I think that's a little overkill, but I don't think it's unfair to say that we should go positive 65 on the orange luminance slider. In the same token, that plays into yellow because orange and yellow are sharing a lot of the same areas down here along the bank of the creek. So if we go all the way up, you'll see even the trees that have some yellow in them are going to lighten up, or we can bring it all the way down and we're gonna get a much darker feature to it. For yellow, since it does impact the trees, even over here, we want to keep that in mind. Now, we don't want to completely darken out this mountain. It'd look kind of silly to have a big black blob down here while we have all of this beautiful, gorgeous detail over here, but we definitely want this to be darker. However, yellow can help us, especially along the top right here where some sunshine's peeking through, in making sure that people know this is a mountain and this has trees on it, but it's also contrasting off of this. So we'll go ahead and we'll bring the yellow up a little bit to pronounce the tops of those trees and to make sure we're very clear that this is indeed a mountain and not just some big black blob. Now green again is going to really affect how this mountain looks right here and the trees that dot it against the snow. So if we go all the way up on green, you'll see that it really brought some brightness out in those trees. If we go all the way down, it just sort of makes these look like little black dots, if anything, maybe very, very dark green. So we're gonna bring the luminance of the green up. I would say positive 50, let's do 60, is gonna be perfect for what we're trying to accomplish. So it may not look like a huge adjustment, but just trust me, in the grand scheme of things, it's really going to make all the difference. With Aqua, I like to bring that down a little bit because again, that's going to influence the back of this photo where we have that more aqua color where it's sort of hazy and the details lost in those mountains that are farther away. So I like to bring that down to negative 35. And then the blue really largely depends upon how you want the sky to look. If we go too bright, you blow the sky back out and there's not a lot of contrast between the blue in the sky and the white in the clouds. But if you bring it down too dark, you've got sort of this very odd, surreal looking photo. Again, it sort of looks like an alien planet, or you turn a photo upside down and this is maybe the ocean with a bunch of waves in it. We don't want that either. But we do want to make sure that again, that blue really pops against those white clouds. So I like to bring it down by like 15 points, and that really pronounces the darker areas of the blue in the sky and contrast them nicely against the white in the clouds. So I'm happy with how this photo looks overall, especially for just a very quick tutorial here on YouTube. If you want to see a before and after, you can do so by coming down to this menu here. You have a few different options. This is where you can see before and after. And what we want to do is before, after, left, right. This is our original photo. This is after we edited, and you'll see we took a very flat photo and we really pronounced some of the colors in it. We brought some contrast and some detail out of it. Overall, a much, much better photograph than before. And you can even change how this looks as well. You can split. So this is what it looked like before. This is what it looks like after. And you can go ahead and reverse those as well so that you can see just how pronounced some of the changes are. Overall, a really, really drastic improvement from our original to our new photo. If you want to go back to just the photo, you just click on this icon right here. So now that we've got our photo where we want it to be, we enter the final step, which is exporting it. So we'll come up to File, click Export, and we want to export to Lightroom Edited Photos. We'll go ahead and change the name to Adobe Lightroom Tutorial Finished Piece. And we'll again talk more about this export folder and some of the finer details like renaming two options in a different tutorial. So we're done with that. We'll go ahead and we'll click Export. And you'll see here up in the upper left-hand corner, we've got a bar telling us where we're at in our export process. And we're done. And it pulls up our file explorer just as we said. And I think something might have happened when I was scrolling. Remember, if you use your scroll wheel on that export menu, you can change settings, and I was a victim of that here. We're gonna go ahead and we'll rename that to what we wanted to rename it to, which was Adobe Lightroom Tutorial Finished Piece 1. And there are our two files right there. So there you have it. That's your tutorial on how to edit landscape photography in Adobe Lightroom Classic. Now keep in mind, that's just how I've chosen to edit in Adobe Lightroom. There are a lot of different ways you can edit landscape photography as well as other photography, so keep that in mind. It's a creative process and everybody does it just a little bit differently. Everybody has their own style. Make sure you find a style that is comfortable for you. Don't try to adjust your work to somebody else's and how they edit their photos, because you're never going to find what truly makes you happy in the work that you put out. I just hope from that tutorial that I've taught you a few little tips and tricks that you can use to improve the quality of your photos and how you edit them. If you like this video, make sure you hit the thumbs up icon down below. It helps me out a lot, and we are still on the quest to 1,000 subscribers. And as I said in my last video, we are closer than we've ever been before. So your support is paramount in my reaching 1,000 subscribers. If you've already subscribed, tell a couple friends to come here and subscribe if you know they'd enjoy my work and they'd actually watch the content I'm producing. And if you haven't subscribed, maybe you're new here, first off, hello and welcome. And I highly encourage you to hit that subscribe button down below. I've got a lot more great content here, both educational and entertaining. But before I go, it is time for our subscriber shout out. And this week's subscriber shout out is also going to be our first guest on the Let's Talk Drones podcast. It's Above AZ. Above AZ is a new channel to YouTube, and it's run by an amazing drone photographer by the name of Amanda. Amanda does some exceptional work. And if you go and subscribe to Above AZ on YouTube, I know you won't be disappointed with the content that gets posted there. Amanda is one of the best drone photographers that I know, and her work speaks for itself. So make sure you check her channel out, Above AZ on YouTube. I highly, highly recommend that you get involved with Amanda's content because it is inspiring and you'll learn quite a bit from her. Until next time, guys, I'm Chris, the Drone Geek, and I am out of here.
Derivative. I want it. It's everything. Derivative. I want it. It's everything.